We begin with a look at freedom of speech. On this, May the 3rd, the day the United Nations has declared World Press Freedom Day. For its own Freedom of Speech award, DW has chosen a reluctant champion from Russia, Yulia Navalnaya. She is Alexei Navalny's widow. He died earlier this year in an Arctic prison, and his death was seen by critics as orchestrated by the Russian government. Navalnaya shares the award with the Russian Anti-Corruption Foundation. That's a group her late husband founded. Navalnaya continues to fight against Putin's Russia.
Earlier this year, she cast her ballot in Russia's presidential election at the embassy in Berlin. An election where any real opposition had long been dealt with by Vladimir Putin. Following the death of Alexei Navalny in an Arctic penal colony, the opposition has been all but decimated in Russia. And the heir apparent is Yulia Navalnaya. It's not a role she has taken on by choice, but by necessity. Just 12 days after her husband's death, she addressed EU lawmakers in Strasbourg.
Putin killed my husband, Alexei Navalny. On his orders, Alexei was tortured for 3 years. He was starved in a tiny stone cell, cut off from the outside world, and denied visits, phone calls, and then even letters. And then they killed him.
Yulia Navalnaya trained as an economist and worked at a bank before marrying Alexei Navalny in 2000. Navalnaya was long a quiet supporter of her husband's anti-corruption efforts. She was his closest political advisor and by his side as he went to court and prison numerous times on charges Kremlin critics say were trumped up. Her profile grew when Navalny was poisoned in 2020. While her husband was fighting for his life in a hospital in Siberia, she issued a public letter to Vladimir Putin and led a pressure campaign to allow her husband to be flown to Germany for treatment. When Alexei Navalny returned to Russia in 2021, police arrested him and detained Yulia Navalnaya, separating the couple for good. She long shunned the spotlight, but after her husband's harsh imprisonment and death, she vowed to continue the fight against the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin has a new vocal critic, not afraid to make use of her freedom of speech.
And we can get more from Roman Goncharenko from DW's Russian service. Good to see you, Roman. Tell us what this award means for Yulia Navalnaya and for the Russian opposition.
Well, I think it means a lot, of course. It's an acknowledgement of what she and her team are doing. And of course, it's also an acknowledgement for her husband who died in prison, as we've heard in the report. She believes that he was killed by the Russian authorities directly or indirectly. And she was on his side. And they are continuing to work for Russia from abroad now. She said she will take over his job. It is still for her to decide how she will do it. But at the moment, as we speak, there are millions and millions of views of a new documentary posted a few days ago on YouTube by her team, the Anti-Corruption Committee. It's a documentary about the rise of Vladimir Putin to power, Russian president. And it is very, very popular. A lot of people in Russia and abroad are talking about it.
OK. Does it really cut through, though? I mean, does this penetrate Russian society to the extent that it's changing minds?
Well, there is a limited possibility to penetrate the Russian society because the Russian society is under strong control of propaganda of the Russian authorities. It is dangerous to oppose the Kremlin policies in Russia, and since the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the Kremlin has increased in its grip on power in Russia. So it's really dangerous. you can be in prison for over 10 years, or you have to leave the country, or you have to be silent. But the documentary I've mentioned is the way of communicating with the Russian society through YouTube, through other channels. And this is what also what Deutsche Welle is doing and continuing to do.
Roman, stay with us for just a moment. We'll come back to you. We're going to take a look at the fact that around the world, press freedom has been falling. Now, that is according to the organisation Reporters Without Borders.
The new World Press Freedom Index has just been published by Reporters Without Borders. Based on data compiled by the organisation, the majority of the countries with the most difficult conditions for journalists are in the Middle East and Asia. Europe remains the region where journalists enjoy the highest level of freedom overall. It's the only part of the world where the situation for journalists is ranked as good in some countries. But even in Europe, the picture's mixed. In the east and southeast of the continent, conditions have deteriorated, and many countries have dropped in the rankings. That includes Belarus, which has now overtaken Russia and Turkey at the bottom of the index to become the worst ranked for press freedom in Europe.
Roman, clearly the state of press freedom in Belarus has become a lot worse. Can you tell us why?
Well, there was a changing moment, I would say, a milestone in 2020, the presidential elections that they were accompanied by protests, opposition protests, and the Belarus leader Alexander Lukashenko claimed his victory. After that, he did a real crackdown on opposition and media, of course. So all the islands of freedom were closed, journalists were imprisoned or had to flee and are now working from Europe. So comparing it with Russia, to a certain extent, it is even worse in Belarus, because there are more journalists now in prison with longer sentences, more than 10 years, some of them. And just a few days ago, Deutsche Welle was labeled as an extremist formation, I quote, in Belarus, which makes it even more difficult for people there to have to watch our programs, to communicate with us in any way. So if you just send us a photo, you can go to prison for up to 7 years in Belarus now. Giving interviews is also very dangerous. So this makes it much more difficult for us to reach audience in Belarus, but we are still working on this. We have our possibilities, and people are watching us in Belarus, still being banned, just like in Russia. People are using VPNs and other options to still get access to not just Deutsche Welle, but Western and independent media in general. So it is a very difficult situation in Belarus, but there is hope.
Roman, thank you so much for that. That's DW's Roman Goncharenko. As we just heard there from Roman, DW is now banned in Belarus, but it's not just DW that's been targeted. Many Belarusian journalists have now fled the country. One of them is Maria Savushkina, who is living in exile here in Berlin. Despite the situation, she continues to fight for press freedom in Belarus.
Maria Savushkina is fighting for a free press in her native Belarus. She has not been able to live and work there for a long time.
We didn't have a free elections campaign. We didn't have media freedom. So we had, time to time, we had political prisoners. And all this was because we have a cruel political regime of Alexander Lukashenko.
Based in Berlin, she now produces anti-regime videos that call out state abusers. Savushkina reaches tens of thousands of people in Belarus with her satire. In her home country, she was active as a journalist and as a campaigner for human rights. Over time, that required more and more courage.
I have never had this kind of experience in my life, what I experienced there. We've been so proud of each other. We've been so brave, and we protect each other.
Things got worse in 2020. There were protests over the allegedly rigged election. Critical journalists were arrested.
We've been sure that at least some people from our team will be arrested in case we will stay inside the country. And we decided to escape.
On Sunday.
First to Ukraine, then to Poland. Now she lives in Berlin with a colleague.
That's a good idea.
I met her and she told me about what's happening to her, about her exile. And press freedom is one of my main issues for decades. And now we are roommates.
Freedom of the press in Belarus is non-existent. Even in Berlin, Maria Savushkina has to be careful and must package her content cleverly.
What I'm trying to do is to find new ways to reach young audience, to reach people in Belarus with news content, but maybe not informative news, but informative political satire, for example. I live here in Germany, in Berlin, but all my thoughts, my home, my family, places I like, they are in Minsk.
She has one request for Europe and the US. Don't forget Belarus, where independent journalists are treated like political prisoners.
Katerina Victoria Weiss is a spokesperson for Reporters Without Borders here in Berlin. She gave us her organization's assessment of the situation in Belarus, where, as we've said, DW has recently been banned and classified an extremist organization by authorities.
We're very sorry about that, but not surprised at all, because to silence independent journalists, the authorities have resorted to state-sponsored terrorism, including censorship, violence, mass arrests, and coordinated raids on homes and media offices, as well as, for example, disbanding the Association of Belarusian Journalists. And I mean, there are multiple examples I could put out now. For example, they even resorted to hijacking a passenger jet in May 2021 in order to arrest an opposition journalist and force him to make like a confession on public television. And then when we recently learned that DW are now banned in Belarus, you know, we were just also feeling very sorry about the contacts you might have over there, because every journalist who is from now on passing on information to the editorial team is now committing a criminal offense, because for you, I mean, no, for them, you guys are an extremist organization.
And it really casts a light on the dangers that journalists face every day in trying to do their work. I want to ask you also about another region in the world that has featured in your report. Gaza, of course, has become an increasingly dangerous place for journalists to do their work. Can you tell us a little bit about what the conditions there are like?
Yes, I mean, wars have always claimed the lives of many, many people, including reporters, for example, now in the Palestinian territories, or since April 2023 in Sudan, where a civil war has been raging. But in Gaza, media professionals are particularly at risk. No other war in the 21st century has started as dangerously for journalists as this one. And even in these circumstances, there are still journalists on the ground who are reporting. However, their work is hampered by several factors. The numerous life-threatening airstrikes, the constantly blocked telephone and internet connections, and of course, the usual problems and fear that come with living in the war. And then the frequent power and internet outages make it super difficult for media professionals to actually make phone calls, charge their phones or cameras, or, just drive and talk to sources.
I'd like to take a look at the EU now as well. We mentioned there that this report found a relatively high level of freedom within Europe compared to some other parts of the world. But I'd like to ask where you see the freedom of press being threatened within EU member states.
I mean, we know that we are immensely privileged in our regions. The only 9 states marked as green, good situation for press freedom in our world map illustrates the index of press freedom are on European continent. For example, like Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands, and so on. And why? The social cultural circumstances are simply better for journalists here in this area. And there is greater appreciation and respect. And there are less obstacles which are hindering us and our colleagues in our work. In addition, the legislative landscape is very much geared towards protecting the freedom of the press. But we also want to highlight that countries like Germany or France, which do have a relative solid situation, also also encounter some problems, and we definitely have to fight to overcome these problems.
Now, just before I let you go, let's zoom out a little bit. Reporters Without Borders publishes this report every year. And when you're looking at the most recent results, would you say that the situation for journalists has worsened over the years?
I mean, I come from a generation where we definitely hoped that the situation is getting better and that we will see progress. But we now see that 75% of all countries definitely suffer from a problematic to a pretty catastrophic situation. So, yes, we see that the situation, unfortunately, is worsening. Also, all human rights situations are worsening. A recent report from Amnesty International was showing that. And we have to talk as a society about how to overcome these very dangerous developments.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. That is Katerina Victoria Weiss from Reporters Without Borders. We very much appreciate your time.